I'm Joanna Marsh, the James Dickey Curator of Contemporary Art, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Smithsonian American Art Museum this evening for what I know will be a fascinating lecture. Before we begin, if I could just ask you to turn off cell phones or other mobile devices. We will have a brief question and answer period at the conclusion of the lecture this evening. We have two microphones set up midway through the auditorium on either aisle. And if you have a question that you would like to ask, if you could just go to one of those microphones so that our audience who's tuning in via webcast can hear the questions and the answers. Tonight's program is actually the fifth lecture in a series that explores the intersection of visual art, environmental science, and natural history. The series was organized in conjunction with our current exhibition, Alexis Rockman, A Fable for Tomorrow, which is on view in our third floor galleries. And it's really inspired by Rockman's own unique cross-disciplinary approach to art making. The final lecture in our series will take place next Wednesday and will feature Christian Samper, the director of the Smithsonian's National Museum for Natural History. So I invite all of you to come back next Wednesday for that lecture. Tonight's speaker is Rhonda Roland Shearer, who joins us from New York City. And I think she will offer a unique perspective on the connection between art and science as a founder of what's called the Art Science Research Laboratory in New York City, which she is currently director of and founded in 1996 along with the late Stephen Jay Gould. In addition to being director of the Art Science Research Laboratory, Shearer is a sculptor, a scholar, and a journalist who pioneered the development of both digital publishing and interdisciplinary scholarship. She's currently adjunct lecturer at the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Iowa. She is developer and a principal investigator for NASA's Astrobiology magazine, which she's been affiliated with since 2005. She has been director, as I mentioned, of the Art Science Research Laboratory since 1996, and she's publisher of the media ethics online news journal, stinkyjournalism.org, since 2004. She's also an associate of Harvard University's Department of Psychology, or was, from 1998 to 2000, where her interdisciplinary research resulted in well over 100 articles, reports, and lectures at universities, both nationally and internationally. She's also a founding member of the Board of Trustees for the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, is that right? In Alexandria, Egypt. And she has just returned to Egypt, I learned a few moments ago. So we are very excited to have Rhonda Roland Shearer with us tonight, and I'm going to welcome her to the stage now.
Thank you. Hello, thank you for being here this evening. And I'm reluctant to really speak about my own art because really this is Alexis Rockman's evening. This is part of this great exhibition. I hope you've all seen it, that is now on the third floor. But I feel it important to discuss what I do and why I do it and how that's contextualized in the greater enterprise called art and science. In order for you to understand my personal perspective on Mr. Rockman's work, because it has to be a personal perspective. I'm an artist, I'm not an expert on his work, but I am a scholar of the generality of art and science, and as an artist on a practical basis, I know what it's about to face, which is traditionally a oxymoron. If I say I'm doing art and science, I get sideways glances. People don't really understand. Sometimes individual artists that aren't quite successful with creating arts based on science may be too descriptive, too literal in what they do in art and science. And that becomes a little bit limited and not experienced in the art world as anything that's powerful or successful. So when I'm talking about art and art production, people, when you're thinking in terms of scientific laws or scientific principles or scientific materials or subjects, people automatically ask me, well, how is that similar to what a scientist does? Isn't art about emotion? That's the first, let's say, bias that people come to the subject of art, is that science is of the mind and art is of the emotion. So therefore, you must be somehow mixing these two things together. Well, really, I want to try to address part of that in the next half hour to be able to perhaps give you a explanation from an artist that does art and science, so you have a sense of how that question is answered. For one thing I want to mention right away is that when you're an artist, you're like a scientist when it comes to your experimentation and production. If I'm in my biology class as a high school student, it's fine to repeat other people's experiments. That's how you learn. This is also true as an artist in training and in development. You do something with clay or with your pencil, and suddenly it looks like a Matisse, or it's reminiscent of a more contemporary artist that you know. This is unsatisfactory. Just as it is for a scientist, you cannot have a professional career repeating other people's experiments. So you're bored, for one thing, and certainly other people won't take a deep interest in your art, and you're not moving forward in terms of this culture of art production that has lived in the form that we're working in now, at least solidly from the mid-19th century. So with that said, as an introduction, I wanted to really talk a moment about, and this is an intro to what I'll be hypothesizing about Rockman's work, is that art, when you're looking at nature and making subjects of, whether it's a sculpture or a painting, and your subject is nature, this was never something easy to do. Despite what one thinks is you paint a still life, you paint a landscape. What's so difficult about that? Well, historically, it's very difficult because it's known by scholars that a landscape or a still life was traditionally known as a woman's painter's subject. So when Rockman's doing landscape and painting nature, this was not high art. Symbolic art or abstraction were really the subjects of choice. To be able to paint a flower or a landscape was not as lofty. And this goes back to the first notions of painting as an individual expression, that symbolic, religious, historic subjects, those were the things of the intellectual, whereas, again, and I'll repeat it, that still life was a woman's painter's subject. So this dichotomy of art science, where you have emotion versus intellect, art science, and you also have that same kind of hierarchy and dualism when it comes to nature versus abstraction. That's another dichotomy. So when Rockman's making these very realistic landscapes and flowers embedded and very strong in his work, this is a challenging thing to have that, especially as a man, to have this expression be something that is accepted and expresses your search for your own expression in visual form, let's say. So for me, I'll just quickly show you, and then I want to bring what I did into what happened historically at the birth of what we call modern art. In other words, going from cubism, where perspective was reduced, until it finally was liberated from that restriction. And the founder of geometric abstraction is considered Piet Mondrian. But let me first show you some of the, so what I did early in my career to survive, I did portraits of racehorses, and this was the first life-size racehorse that was in Ireland. And now when I did these still lifes, the art curators I would talk to, I'd say that I felt this was very rebellious, not conservative, because in the history of sculpture, you really didn't have still life or landscape. You didn't have plants because of the technical limitations. How do you make thin leaves? Well, I had to go into the actual casting process and actually look at the aspects of casting molten bronze into molds, and to look at the fluid dynamics of how that's done. And I also had to know about shrinkage. If the horse is supposed to stand at a certain height and the owner expects it to be a model of the actual animal, then I had to figure out the shrinkage, that lengths would shrink 1/16 per foot when it was a straight length, but if it was a bounded shape, it would shrink less. So I'm thinking, even within my own bias, I thought, boy, I should have studied harder in math class in high school, thinking that I wouldn't really need the mathematics, I wouldn't need the science. Again, this overarching bias of separating these disciplines, which is a tradition in our culture, actually paralyzes and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of having a breakdown actually occur. It's when you have a demand of what you're trying to do in art that often is when the ability of having to actually do and work with math and science actually comes forth. So with that said, I started looking at the history of art, and I came up with what I called the flatland hypothesis. And this came from noting that the two greatest revolutions in art, the two greatest changes, were at the birth of Renaissance perspective, when you had two-dimensional symbolic art on a plane, all of a sudden look as if it was an optical experience similar to what we see in reality. And Brunelleschi was one of the first to use it, but he didn't publish. And more famously, Leonardo illustrated a book on perspective, but it already was in wide use by that time. But it was a powerful and quantitative revolution in art, where you could really see the difference between symbolic, flat, two-dimensional images versus 3 dimensions. The second revolution was the birth of modernism with cubism, where perspective, the 3-dimensional illusion, is suddenly interrupted. It's sliced through, it's melted, it's blown up in different ways. And that was based on artists also thinking within a new geometry. So just as Brunelleschi and others were thinking in terms of a geometric structure of which to create a 3-dimensional illusion of space, Picasso, Braque, Duchamp, Mondrian, and others were thinking within the new geometries of their time, called non-Euclidean geometry, where they were thinking in terms of curved space. they were thinking in terms of higher dimensions than 3. And I'm not talking about the 4th dimension of time, spatial dimensions of 4, 5, and 6 and higher. This was something widely talked about, and it was based at the time on the writings, the popular writings of Henri Poincaré. So I can't get too much into that at this time, but suffice to say that the 2 greatest revolutions had something to do with mathematics and artists thinking within new spatial structures that liberated them and allowed them to express something that would be experienced by the viewer and the artist themselves as something new. So as an artist looking at this, I thought that perhaps there was an underlying principle that lied there, and that's what I called the flatland hypothesis, that fundamental to how we think and structure reality is through geometric structures. So when those structures become, there are new options to think within new structures, that creativity or large leaps of invention can occur. So I, in my own art, started doing what Mondrian did and many others did, is looking at nature and trying to carve through, using Euclidean geometry, the lines and angles, into nature to try to flay open the laws or principles within. Pete Mondrian, this is essentially what he was doing. He was looking into nature and carving out what he thought was the essence of line and right angle in the vertical position. And he equated this with truth about the world. So I'm going to show you in a moment a series where Mondrian did that. And I think this is Mondrian is a very good example of how someone who's not familiar or trained in looking at abstraction can actually understand it and how it came about. So anyway, so this is this piece is about 13 feet tall. And so what I was doing was combining nature as Euclidean forms with fractal structures. And just a brief definition of a fractal structure is, this was a branch of mathematics that was developed by the late Benoit Mandelbrot, and he recognized that there were patterns in nature that couldn't be described. So for example, what do you say about a cloud? It's a cloud shape. You couldn't say it was a circle. You couldn't say it was an oval. It was something else. So what I was looking for is combining, since the 2 greatest revolutions in art coincided with artists thinking within new geometries, I reasoned that since fractal geometry was the most recent and new geometry, that I would think within that geometry in order to try to explore and come up with something new. That was my reasoning. So here's another one. This was on 23rd Street in Manhattan in the traffic island. And here I was dealing with these different images of women that in heroic, she's 12 feet tall. So when you put her in a park and there's George Washington, but the woman's doing housework, I had noted that there's hundreds and hundreds of sculptures in New York City. None are of real women, except there's a recent one of Eleanor Roosevelt. There was a kind of small one of Gertrude Stein. And Alice in Wonderland is not a role model, And you have symbolic nymphs and so forth, but essentially all the sculptures, and you have Joan of Arc, who may or may not have been a real person, but essentially I was looking at how we contextualize women and nature as one, and that women's work is part of nature. So this is what I was looking at, and it was interesting because there was a sign. You notice how delicate these are. These pieces were not vandalized at all, and they were out for months. And I thought that was very interesting. And further, there was a sign that said when the exhibition was leaving. And I come early in the morning, the truck's there and so forth, and all of a sudden I look and I see George Washington. The women were all surrounding George Washington, and the press had fun with it, saying, hey, George, get off your high horse and help with the dishes. You know, there'd be these kinds of headlines. But I noticed there was something here in George's hand. And then I took a closer look. Somebody had stuck a toilet brush up on George's hand. And I got the message. It was like your exhibition is leaving, but your message lives on. And I turned around and I saw Mahatma Gandhi and had a broom stuck next to his staff. So I, in particular, enjoy these public exhibitions because I have a chance to talk about the art in an informal way. And people really look and ask about the science and so forth. So I'm going to close this and I'm going to go here. Now, what I want to show here is, I'm going to go to the next one. This is Mondrian's red tree. And he did a tree, this is his gray tree. He did trees in a series. But you see how the trees dematerialize? This is really an important principle. And this is where I'm going to segue into talking about Rockman's work now. He was struggling, with his paintbrush, with his eyes to see into nature. So he had to cut away what he thought were the irrational, random, and he even characterized them as the feminine aspects of nature. He was really operating on a moral, ethical level of this dualism of the male versus female, nature versus abstract. And so anyway, but I think that when people are puzzled by, well, what's that mess? My 5-year-old could do it. I wish I had $1 every time I heard that. But it's true that unless you expose people and really show the artist's perspective of how and why they're making abstraction and what it means, it can be very alienating. And that's why a lot of times very contemporary or minimalistic sculptures get a lot of vandalism, is because people feel like they're being talked down to. But this is really just a question of communication and education. So, and what I wanted to show here was just an example of that symbolic flat space versus geometric perspective. I mean, this was revolutionary at the time of Brunelleschi. And when you had this kind of abstraction in the early teens, it was considered also revolutionary. At the Armory show in New York, you had Teddy Roosevelt writing a column in one of the newspapers saying that Navajo Indian blankets were better than what he was looking at, and there was recommendations not to let children and pregnant women into the exhibition. So the idea of trying to, and I was going to show here just some of the typical, like here, this is this idea that it comes from human behavior, this idea of conquering and so forth, but you have the slaves that are often represented this way. You have Apollo, and someone there's even sitting. If you're sitting, you're even high up. And I always joke, you don't even need a whole man. A partial one will do. You can see here, you've just got a bust, and the figure of the woman is there. So let me switch. I'm going to switch now to my now, I chose this title for Hijacked, Alexis Rockman's Paintbrushes in the Art and Science of Nature's Laws, for a reason which will become clear to you after I present these 11 images. When I look at Alexis' work, it really, even though it's often, and I'm sure accurately so, contextualized within the history of natural history painting and so forth, I see as an artist a very personal struggle, just like with Mondrian slicing through those trees. I see a personal struggle with Rockman and nature's laws, that his paintbrushes are carving out and trying to place himself in relationship to overwhelming nature. And he seems to switch roles depending on what painting you're looking at. And so I want to start off by, this is a painting that Steve, my late husband, Stephen J. Gould, who knew Alexis and wrote essays for 2 different catalogs. We had this in our home, and it's obviously incorporating sex, reproduction. You see the eggs here and so forth. But there's something that's foreboding about the activity here, because in one sense, it's like an interruption of a sexual activity, but it's outside the species in the sense of that there's something that's breaking the law of nature here. So this is Alexis breaking the law of nature. He's playing with that. He's moving that. So in the one hand, you get the shock, but if you really look at it, that's what you're really seeing. You're seeing something fundamentally disturbed with what we expect in nature. And so his one work, which was one of the more early ones, I think it's more subtle, but again, this idea of a taxonomic structure. It's an ordering imposed on nature. It's not real. You may, in fact, genetically have these different relationships, but in a taxonomy, this is a human construction that orders nature. And you can actually, just like the periodic table, there are all different ways you can organize the elements of nature, and there's different ways and competing theories of how you can do these trees. But I think what's telling here is this ghost figure. It's always something left out, that it's unknown, that's distrusted. That it's like he's painting the structure, but he's got it in reserve, where he's not sure, he's doubting, and it's a way of keeping control at the same time. Alexis is not subsumed by this taxonomic structure. As an artist, he's keeping his distance for possibility. Now, this is one I thought that was interesting, and it was in the catalog that they have the original print that this piece was derived. And what was noted in the catalog, and I believe correctly, was that the catalog image is very straightforward. And here you have the dripping of fluids and the decay. But I think what's so striking here is the face. It's a very human face of submitting to this natural process. And again, I see the artist here. I see him submitting to the human process. I see these bugs that aren't even ones that really devour flesh. They're just crawling, and he's hung here to rot. So I found that this was quite telling about how personal the science of Rockman is. And now here is another way. We always see those paintings of the dogs playing cards, or there's different ways of treating domestic animals or wild animals and humanizing them or anthropomorphizing them. And in this case, again, this is almost mocking nature. In other words, by having these creatures be not only within a human context, but mocked, made fun of. This, to me, is indicating that the rabbit is humiliated, that the law of nature, when combined with human will, creates something else. And in one sense, it's a way of defeating nature, but I think the painting acknowledges, and especially this is something you would use, a symbol of a rose from early pre-modern art as carrying a message here that this is a symbolic work in the history of nature as symbol. Now, I think this is an interesting work, and I noticed there's others similar. When you look at it, it looks like a tree. And then you start looking more and more, and then you see, no, actually, it's very mechanical and man-made. Again, that trick of the eye where, as an artist, you're putting down the paint, where you know you're making something mechanical that at first glance will appear naturalistic. Again, that trick or twist is what allows your viewer to participate in the creative process. That discomfort, that squeamish feeling that you have. I think this is very interesting about and very successful in his work. And perhaps, and when I'll get to some other ones where it can be misinterpreted as too literal a shock value, when actually I think something deeper is going on. Let's see, we've got, now here's one I'm referring to, that here you have a mammal with an insect, a mating. This obviously is disturbing because it so fundamentally violates what we know and are comfortable with. So for me, looking at the artist generating this, I'm seeing this as an aggressive act. As someone who's not wanting to be bound by those kinds of conventions of nature's laws and what we've learned. So he has a whole series of these. Now you've got domesticated animals, and you have a sense of that you have the pig is not portrayed in an attractive way. This kind of breaking up of color is part of domestication that you see in fur patterns. And a pig is never complimentary in our culture, even though as highly intelligent as pigs are known to be. And again, you have this repeated theme of you have the sloth, and it's trying to eat a frog, which wouldn't be what the creature would be using its tongue for. And let's see. Now, to me, this is quite a powerful piece, and it really emphasizes my point of the almost primal scream aspect, of this emotion coming from, I think, in the catalog it said a wild boar, but to me it looks like those little javelinas that they have in the South. And this looks like, I don't know, it has a lot of whiskers. I don't know if the nutria have that many whiskers. Somebody has to help me with that. But I found that, again, it's really a comment about him, the artist, more than a comment about broader nature. To me, this is very, very personal painting. Now, this is my take on it, and this is why I want to explain to you that I'm an artist, and that's where I'm seeing it and experiencing it. But I look at this, and I see it's just such personal railing against the decay, the inevitable decay that happens to all of us and is happening in a greater context of life on the planet. Now, I offer this as evidence of my hypothesis about Alexis and the very personal nature of what he does and how he's breaking laws and how he twists it around where sometimes humans are winning, like in the rabbit that's humiliated, versus in this javelina where nature's and the laws are winning. It plays different positions on the game board. Here, if you note, this is Rockman Airline. This is his airplane. He's the subject of this painting. And you've got this, and I noted in the exhibition that this is has real elements, like it's like a collage with a photo and different materials. So rather than just an illusion of things or thingness, it actually is using real materials, which further supports my perspective, I believe. So here you have birds being sucked into the engine. So here you have nature and life, and it's really being sucked in and carved up by Rockman's airplane engine, by Rockman himself. This is my take on what he does, and this, for me, was the more personal bit of evidence which supports my hypothesis. And so you have, I feel, a final image I wanted to put out, a image here where it's a very boyish, and if you've ever seen or knew Alexis over time, he's a very boyish-faced figure. I can't help but think that this is him. And he's with an early ancestor, or certainly an ape, but he's got the alcohol here. This looks like probably a whiskey bottle in the jungle with perhaps a shot glass, and you've got a gun. So even though it's called conversation, there's this element of a fight, literally with the weapon. And so I want to conclude in terms of my comments on his work that when it comes to he producing art that communicates to the world his feelings and thoughts, that he is never absent. He's very, very present in his work, which is not often what you see. So it indicates an emotional life, and I really don't know him that well, but it indicates an emotional life and sensitivity, not just a literal, descriptive, trying to show apocalyptic images. I believe it's much deeper of what's going on here, and I want to end on this image, and perhaps I could take a few questions. Is that possible? If can we have the house lights up maybe a little? Let's see. I'm going to close this here, and I'm going to reopen. I'm going to try to see. Let me show you. I can show you one thing here about fractals. This is why fractals became important, because nature shapes were considered irrational because they didn't have a geometric description. So suddenly, now that you have clouds and fire able to be described as fractal structures that even can be generated on a computer that look like photographic images of trees and mountains, suddenly you don't have this dichotomy between what's supposedly rational versus irrational, and what's feminine versus masculine. And I have this kind of chart that is typical of where the taxonomy of our values, the geometries aren't just measuring systems. They're employed to organize our social values and our art. So when you're talking about looking at nature as feminine, that's in opposition to Euclidean geometry that's considered rational and masculine. But all of a sudden, if nature's forms have rational structures called fractals, suddenly that taxonomy collapses. And this is typical of what happens in scientific revolutions, is that the existing value systems and taxonomic structures of how we order reality implode or become contradictory. So just a quick thing so you can understand what a fractal structure is. There are two aspects to fractal structures. One is fractal scaling and self-similarity. So you see that right here with just a small part of a cauliflower, that the small part, like Russian stacking dolls, echoes the whole. So this is showing you two things. It's fractal scaling. In other words, if I photographed that and didn't have this, you wouldn't know the size. There's a size ambiguity there to that fractal structure. So that's one characteristic that defines fractals, is that it has this scaling feature as well as self-similarity. The other aspect of fractals is fractal dimension. And that's where when you have a shape like this, you're greater than 2 dimensions, but less than 3, because it's not completely filling the space. So scientists or mathematicians would talk about, say, 2.3 fractal dimensions. So it really is quite revolutionary. However, the science often lags behind the mathematics. In other words, Einstein used and credited Riemannian geometry, the geometry of curved space, that was considered so ugly and fearsome and scary for Gauss, the famous mathematician Gauss, that he didn't even want to reveal to the world he found it. What Riemannian geometry basically did was, in an era, even in the early 20th century, when Euclid's Elements was considered something as true as the Bible. In fact, the clergy would incorporate it. And if you want to know about truth, you can read Euclid's axioms. It was supposed to be the truth not only of nature, but the truth of God that joins through mathematics. So when Gauss and others, and Riemann in particular, discovered that when you map a triangle on a sphere and the angles add up to greater than 180 degrees, as opposed to that all triangles, the angles add up to 180 degrees, that was considered ugly and scary. And in fact, some clergy, actually in Washington, I had papers where they called it the devil's geometry, because it so undermined this conflation of truth with mathematics. So when you talk about Einstein crediting Riemannian geometry, how did that happen? Well, he read and studied Riemann's geometry about curved space, and then he reasoned that maybe this is not just a mathematics, maybe it's about a truth about the world. And in the greater world, that maybe space is not uniform but curved, and that gravity will distort it. So that's why he credits Riemann, is that this odd, ugly geometry that inspired Picasso, Braque, all the modernists, they all were talking about it, that, because they love artists love revolutionary things, typically. So Einstein was able to show the power of Riemannian geometry through his scientific discovery that showed that it applied to the real world. It just wasn't abstract mathematics. So with that said, there hasn't been the science discovered yet that fractal geometry and part of a larger, it's really the mathematics or the geometry of nonlinear dynamics, or also known as chaos theory. That field has not really gone beyond a certain point, which is limited. The great discovery hasn't been yielded from it. So with that said, for artists, it really is an important thing to look at, in that it's another way of describing space and form that's outside of the normal abstraction that we're taught in school, is the only possibility. Okay, well, thank you very much. And so if anybody has any questions or comments, now's the time. If we could have the house lights, someone. Good.
Rhonda, thank you so much for coming. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
I wonder if you could just talk for a minute about your work at the Art Science Research Laboratory and tell us a little bit about what happens there and how art and science are combined or connected.
Okay. I'd be happy to. What we have done is, I guess this is a good example here. Many of you are familiar with the artist Marcel Duchamp, and he is considered with Picasso by a majority of art historians to be the greatest influence on the 20th century in terms of artists' art production. Now, unlike Picasso, Duchamp's influence continues even into the 21st century. And my interest was really in Duchamp because he was considered the artist that knew most about art and science compared to all the other artists. And when I read that and heard that, then I started studying him to see, what he was doing with mathematics and the science of his time, which really was the earliest form of interest in fractal geometry. It wasn't called that then. Henri Poincaré was the mathematician and scientist who was considered and still considered today as the father of chaos theory. And so Duchamp said that Poincaré was at the bottom of everything he was doing. So with that said, what my work and others related to the lab, and this kind of epitomizes it, is looking at the artists' science in their art and reading and thinking about what they were studying, and then using that as a lens to look back at the work. So here's an example of when I did this. I had read an essay written by Henri Poincaré on mathematical discovery, and he was talking about how in scientific discovery or mathematical discovery that some idea, you'll be thinking about something and suddenly it'll drop into your conscious mind as if ready-made. And he used that in the essay, and many of the things he was saying in this essay sounded peculiarly like Duchamp's work and words he used and so forth. So you might know that Duchamp famously created a category of art called ready-mades, where allegedly it's just objects bought in a store and that he signs them and then they're transformed into art by virtue of the artist's choice or selection. So this is an example where I looked at the hat rack, and here's the hat rack as I saw in the Whitney after I read Poincaré's essay, and I noticed the hooks go the wrong way. You can't really hang hats on it. The hats will fall off. And then I started looking at the whole history of hat racks, and there's none that are even close to this. And then I look at the blueprint. This could never, it's like an IQ test. They'll have the two-dimensional form of something and then a three-dimensional, and you have to make the match up by transforming it. This two-dimensional drawing would never generate that, ever. Okay, so, and then I started studying and taking his ready-mades and mapping them through time, and then I noticed each one is different. And there were many, or most, the original object was lost, or the original object was lost twice. And all you had were photos, drawings, models. And so this is the kind of thing, this idea of doing the analysis of the photographs, and doing the geometric analysis and really trying to look at what these objects are in a way that sets you outside of the narrative. In other words, it's very powerful when you're trained to what Duchamp's objects are, as opposed to using scientific method to look to see what Duchamp's objects are. And that's really that epitomizes really what we do at the lab in different ways. And we do it with art objects as well as in journalism. So this idea of testing facts in major reports and then telling what the truth of the matter is part of what we've done at the lab. And significantly looking at scientific reports where they're allegedly describing Papua New Guinea culture and supposedly about warfare. And this is an example of one I can give you where Jared Diamond wrote an essay in the New Yorker in April 2008, and he made a claim that about these warriors and revenge and how they were killing each other, and it was a quite elaborate story. But at the heart of the story, he said that the enemy of his driver, who was getting revenge for his Uncle Saul's death, was paralyzed in a wheelchair for 11 years, rolling around the villages in his wheelchair, and he had a spinal injury. So I'm saying, wait a minute, 11 years, and to try to keep, we couldn't keep Superman, Christopher Reeves, alive in New Jersey, with millions of dollars, because it's very difficult with pressure wounds and infection and so forth when someone's paralyzed to keep them alive. So I asked the New Yorker if they fact-checked that Izum was paralyzed in a wheelchair, and they said everything was fact-checked. But it happened to be that I was already doing research in New Guinea, so I asked some researchers to go in and check. And meantime, we find this man walking around. He was not ever in a wheelchair. He had no spinal injury. So the import of this is not that this is I mean, it is kind of dada and ridiculous, in one sense, but the importance is that these men were never informed that they were going to be in the New Yorker. They had no idea, and this got the one man in a lot of trouble. There was no informed consent, let's put it that way. And they didn't recognize that one of their tribesmen was a lawyer with a PhD in law, who proceeded to get a lawyer and sue them here in the United States. So it's a whole morass, but the importance is that the idea of critical thinking and scientific method, encouraging it in media, and using scientific experts, and applying that method to fields that normally aren't using it, like art history, or journalism. And that's, in essence, what we do in different ways, and the outcome of that is having students say, I really now see things in a different way, and when they tell me that, then I know that we've had that success where you're actually witnessing a young person developing critical thinking capacity. So, is any other comments or questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much. And